A new police chief walks into his precinct undercover, hoping to observe his officers without their masks on. But when a white cop spits in his face thinking he's just a nobody, the entire room is moments away from a shocking revelation that will leave them all reeling. It was a muggy Tuesday morning in August when Richard Nelson, a newly appointed police chief, stepped out of his car in the heart of Blue Ridge, a small city tucked away in the rolling hills of North Carolina, dressed in a simple plaid shirt, worn jeans, and scuffed sneakers. He didn't look the part of a man who had spent 2 decades climbing the ranks in law enforcement that was exactly his intention. Richard believed in seeing things for what they truly were not, through the polished lens of scheduled meetings or rehearsed welcomes. As a black man stepping into a leadership role in a precinct plagued by whispers of misconduct, he wanted to observe the department unfiltered. What better way to do that than to blend in the precinct's parking lot, buzzed with officers coming and going? Richard scanned the area, noting the casual banter and occasional glances his way. No one seemed to recognize him, which was unsurprising. His appointment had been announced just days ago, and he had chosen not to publicize his arrival until the official inspection later that morning. He adjusted the brim of his baseball cap and took a deep breath. The weight of his mission to root out the toxicity festering within the department pressed heavy on his shoulders. He was no stranger to resistance, but he knew this job would test him in ways he hadn't yet imagined. As he approached the building, the faint sound of laughter carried through the air. Richard stepped through the precinct's side entrance unnoticed among the hum of casual chatter and ringing phones. The tiled floors glistened under harsh fluorescent lights, and the smell of stale coffee hung in the air. He walked slowly, observing the dynamics around him. Groups of officers huddled near desks, some swapping stories, others reviewing paperwork. No one paid him much attention until he paused near the break room. "Hey, you!" A sharp voice cut through the noise. Richard turned to see a white officer striding toward him, a smug grin plastered on his face. His badge read Officer Daniels behind him. A few others leaned against the wall, watching with interest. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but Daniels didn't give him the chance. "Lost. This isn't a shelter," the officer said, his tone dripping with condescension. "You need to take that mess somewhere else." Richard froze, the words landing like a punch. He wasn't sure whether to correct the man immediately or let the scene unfold further before he could decide. Daniel stepped closer, his voice rising for the benefit of his audience. "Didn't you hear me get out of here? We don't need people like you hanging around." Laughter erupted from the onlookers, and Richard clenched his jaw, his heart pounding. He tried to speak, but Daniels leaned in his face inches away. Then, without warning, the officer spit straight into Richard's face. Time seemed to stop. Richard's breath hitched as the warm saliva dripped down his cheek around him. The laughter grew louder. One officer slapped the table, doubling over in amusement, while another muttered something about showing the riffraff. Their place, Richard's mind raced. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, but he kept his composure. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a handkerchief to wipe his face. His movements slow and deliberate. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Daniel smirked. "Only the ones who don't belong here." The group burst into laughter again, but Richard said nothing instead. He turned and walked down the hallway, leaving the officers behind as he headed toward the precinct's main office. An intercom crackled to life, calling all personnel to the briefing room. It was time. The briefing room was abuzz with chatter as officers filed in, some carrying coffee mugs, others laughing over inside jokes. Richard entered through a side door, now holding a folder that bore the precinct's official seal. He stood just out of view, watching the room fill with familiar faces, some still chuckling from the earlier incident at the front of the room. Captain Harris, a stout man with a graying mustache, called for order. "All right, settle down, everyone. We've got an important introduction today." The officers quieted, their curiosity piqued. Daniels leaned against the wall. His arms crossed, a smug expression still plastered on his face. The man was clearly enjoying his morning. Captain Harris cleared his throat, as most of you know. Chief Caldwell retired last month. We've been waiting for his replacement, and I'm pleased to introduce our new leader, a man with an impressive record and a vision for this department. Richard stepped forward. His footsteps measured the room, froze as he walked to the podium, his presence commanding attention. He placed the folder on the lectern and slowly scanned the room. His calm demeanor only heightened the tension. Daniel's smirk faltered. The color drained from his face as recognition dawned. The other officers exchanged uneasy glances, some whispering, others staring at Richard with wide eyes. "Good morning," Richard began, his voice steady. "My name is Richard Nelson. As of today, I'm your new chief of police." The silence was deafening. Daniel's face turned a deep shade of red, his bravado evaporating. Richard's gaze landed on him, holding for a moment longer than necessary before sweeping across the rest of the room. "When I arrived this morning," Richard continued, "I came in plain clothes because I wanted to see the department through an unfiltered lens. What I witnessed was eye-opening." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Richard raised a hand to silence it. "In my brief time here, I've already seen behaviors that are not just unprofessional but downright unacceptable. Let me make one thing clear. The culture that has been allowed to fester here ends." Today, the room remained eerily quiet. The weight of his words sinking in, Daniels shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the floor. Richard took a step closer to the edge of the podium. His tone, sharp but controlled respect, is not optional. It's the foundation of what we do as law enforcement. Without it, we fail. Not just each other, but the community we serve. He let the silence hang for a moment, watching the officers squirm under his gaze. "This morning, some of you laughed at what you thought was just another powerless man being put in his place. But let me remind you, everyone who walks through those doors deserves respect, whether they're wearing a badge or not." His words cut through the room like a blade. No one dared to move. Richard let the silence linger, his gaze unwavering. The tension in the room was palpable, each officer acutely aware of the weight of his words. Daniels shifted again, his discomfort evident as beads of sweat formed on his brow. But Richard wasn't done. "I understand that change is difficult," he said, his voice steady but laced with authority. "But let me be clear, there will be no tolerance for behavior that disrespects the dignity of any individual, whether they are a colleague, a civilian, or anyone else." He stepped down from the podium, walking slowly toward the officers his presence was commanding. Yet his tone carried a controlled intensity. "Officer Daniels," Richard said, stopping just a few feet away from the man. Daniels flinched, his bravado from earlier completely dissolved. "You," Richard continued, locking eyes with him, "represent everything that's broken in this department. When you spat in my face, it wasn't just me you disrespected. It was the badge, the oath, and the community we swore to protect." Daniel stammered, "Chief, I didn't." "That's exactly the problem," Richard cut in, his voice sharp. "You didn't care to know. You didn't stop to think before you acted, because you assumed the man standing in front of you didn't matter. And that assumption is exactly why this department has lost the trust of the very people it's supposed to protect." The room was silent, every officer frozen. Richard turned to face the rest of them. "What I saw wasn't just one man's failure. It was a reflection of a culture where bullying and prejudice aren't just allowed, they're encouraged. And that ends now." He stepped back toward the podium, his voice rising with conviction. "I've spent my career fighting for justice, not just in the streets, but within departments like this one. Change isn't easy. It won't come overnight. But hear me clearly. As long as I'm chief, this precinct will be run with integrity, respect, and accountability." He paused, letting his words sink in, then gave a nod to Captain Harris. "Effective immediately, Officer Daniels is suspended pending an internal investigation. And if any of you think this is just for show, think again. This is the first of many changes. Gasps swept through the room. Daniel's face flushed red, his jaw clenched as he avoided everyone's eyes. Richard stood firm, unmoved. This isn't about punishment, he continued. It's about setting a standard, and if you're not ready to meet that standard, this isn't the place for you. He scanned the room, locking eyes with each officer. But if you are, if you're ready to do better, be better, then we'll move forward together. Just know, I will hold you accountable. Every step, office the way. The meeting ended in thick silence. Officers shuffled out without their usual banter. Richard remained at the podium, watching as Daniel stormed out, humiliated and angry. The others avoided his gaze, their faces marked with guilt, discomfort, or reflection. Later, back in his office, Richard sank into his chair, exhaling deeply. He knew this was only the beginning. Changing a culture built over years wouldn't be easy, and for some it might never happen. But he hadn't come to Blue Ridge to be liked. He came to make a difference. The phone rang. "Chief, I just wanted to say, you handled that better than most would have," Captain Harris said, his voice cautious. "Thanks, Captain," Richard replied. "But this was just the first step. The real work begins now. I want Daniel's full record, complaints, incident reports, on my desk by tomorrow." "Everything you've got," Richard said. "You got it," Harris replied, then paused. "And Chief, I think you shook a few of them today, in a good way." Richard hung up, allowing himself a brief moment of satisfaction before turning his attention to the stack of paperwork waiting on his desk. Over the next few weeks, the precinct began to feel like a different place. The same officers who once laughed at Daniel's behavior now kept their distance, whispers of his suspension spreading quickly through the halls. Richard made it a point to walk the station regularly, greeting everyone he passed. His steady presence was a clear signal. Things had changed. Some officers took the shift seriously. One day, Officer Reyes, a young recruit, approached him. She looked nervous but determined. "I just want to say, I know I went along with a lot of things before. I was scared to speak up. But I want to do better, Chief." "That's all I ask," Richard said gently. "It starts with you." But not everyone was ready to change. Daniels filed an appeal, claiming his suspension was unjust. Richard stood firm. Accountability, he believed, wasn't negotiable. The department's review uncovered a troubling history, multiple complaints against Daniels for excessive force and inappropriate remarks. His appeal was denied. Richard made it clear. The days of ignoring misconduct were over. Despite the progress, Richard knew real change would take time. Conversations about bias and rebuilding community trust were met with resistance from some. But he pressed on. Every small step, a rookie asking hard questions, a veteran rethinking old habits, was a win. At a community event one morning, Richard met a young boy who approached him shyly. "Are you really the chief?" the boy asked, eyes wide with curiosity. "I am," Richard replied with a warm smile. "My dad says police don't care about people like us," the boy said quietly. Richard knelt down to meet his eyes. "I can't change what happened before," he said gently, "but I promise we're working hard to do better. And if you ever need help, you come find me, all right?" The boy nodded, a small smile forming. Moments like that reminded Richard why he had taken the job. By the end of his first year, the precinct wasn't perfect, but it was no longer the same place. Officers unwilling to change had moved on. New recruits with fresh perspectives filled their spots. The community, once rightfully wary, began to notice the shift, a department making real efforts to listen and rebuild trust. One evening, Richard stood in the main hallway watching officers head out for the night. The laughter and conversation felt different now, genuine, respectful, no longer rooted in exclusion or cruelty. There were still challenges ahead, but for the first time, Richard felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. Change would never be easy, but it was worth every battle.